He was Hitler's favorite general, the legendary Desert Fox, who commanded the respect of enemies and allies alike. Yet in the final year of his life, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel turned against the Führer he had once served with distinction. But what drove one of Nazi Germany's most celebrated military commanders to betray the regime that had elevated him to greatness? The answer reveals a complex web of military failure, moral awakening, and desperate conspiracy that would ultimately cost Rommel his life. In this video, we will find out. So, without further ado, let's start with the first name on our list. Erwin Johannes. Eugen Rommel was born on November 15th, 1891, in the small town of Heidenheim an der Brenz in the Kingdom of Württemberg, which was then part of the German Empire. His father, also named Erwin Rommel, was a school teacher and later a school administrator, while his mother, Helene von Lutz, came from a family of modest means. The Rommel household was one of discipline, education, and traditional Lutheran values. Young Erwin was the third of 5 children, and from an early age he displayed a keen mind and a natural aptitude for mathematics and engineering. His childhood was unremarkable in many ways, marked by the typical pursuits of a middle-class German boy at the turn of the century. He enjoyed outdoor activities, showed interest in mechanics, and possessed a quiet determination that would later define his military career. Unlike many of the Prussian aristocrats who dominated the German officer corps, Rommel came from bourgeois stock, a fact that would colour his relationship with the military establishment throughout his life. In July 1910, at the age of 18, Rommel joined the 124th Württemberg Infantry Regiment as a Fähnrich, or officer cadet. This decision to pursue a military career was not driven by family tradition or social expectation, but rather by Rommel's own inclination towards service and adventure. His early training at the EES Officer Cadet School in Danzig was rigorous, and Rommel proved himself to be a capable, if unremarkable, student. He was commissioned as a lieutenant in January 1912, beginning a military career that would span more than 3 decades. During these early years, Rommel met Lucia Maria Mollin, known as Lucy, at a dance in Danzig. Their courtship was long and often interrupted by military duties, but they would eventually marry in November 1916, a union that would last until Rommel's death. When the First World War erupted in August 1914, Lieutenant Rommel was assigned to the 124th Infantry Regiment and deployed to France. It was in the trenches and battlefields of the Great War that Rommel first displayed the tactical brilliance and personal courage that would become his hallmarks. In September 1914, during an engagement near Verdun, Rommel led a small patrol that successfully captured a French position, despite being outnumbered. His aggressive tactics and willingness to take calculated risks earned him the Iron Cross, second class, one of Germany's highest military honours. But this was only the beginning. Throughout 1915 and 1916, Rommel saw action on both the Western and Eastern fronts, including service in the Argonne Forest and Romania. He was wounded twice, once by shrapnel and once by a bullet, but each time he recovered and returned to the front with renewed determination. The defining moment of Rommel's First World War service came in October 1917 during the Battle of Caporetto in Italy. As part of the German-Austrian offensive against Italian forces, Rommel commanded a mountain battalion of the Württemberg Mountain Battalion. In a series of audacious maneuvers that would become textbook examples of infiltration tactics, Rommel led his men deep behind Italian lines, capturing thousands of prisoners and strategic positions with minimal casualties. On one occasion, Rommel and a small detachment of soldiers captured an entire Italian regiment, along with its artillery, by exploiting confusion and moving with such speed that the enemy had no time to organize a defense. In a period of less than 60 hours, Rommel's battalion captured approximately 9,000 Italian soldiers, 81 artillery pieces, and numerous other weapons and supplies. For these extraordinary achievements, Rommel was awarded the Pour le Mérite, Germany's highest military decoration, an honour rarely bestowed upon an officer of his relatively junior rank. At age 26, Rommel had become one of the youngest German officers to receive this prestigious award. The end of the First World War in November 1918 brought defeat and humiliation to Germany. But for Rommel, it also brought an opportunity to continue his military career. Unlike many officers who left the service during the dramatic downsizing imposed by the Treaty of Versailles, Rommel chose to remain in the newly formed Reichswehr, the defensive army that replaced the Imperial German Army. Throughout the 1920s and early 1930s, Rommel served in various capacities, including as an instructor at the infantry school in Dresden. It was during this period that he began to develop and refine his tactical theories, drawing on his experiences from the First World War. He emphasized speed, surprise, and the initiative of junior officers, principles that would later inform his approach to armored warfare, even though he had not yet commanded tanks. In 1929, Rommel was appointed to the infantry school at Dresden as an instructor, where he taught tactics and military history to the next generation of German officers. Rommel's personal life during this period was marked by stability and domesticity. His marriage to Lucy produced one son, Manfred Rommel, who was born on December 24, 1928. The family lived modestly, and Rommel was known among his colleagues as a devoted husband and father who eschewed the social climbing and political manoeuvring common among ambitious officers. He was not a member of the Nazi Party, nor did he move in the circles of the Prussian aristocracy that dominated the German military establishment. Instead, Rommel focused on his professional duties and his family, maintaining a reputation for competence, integrity, and political neutrality. This very neutrality, paradoxically, would later make him attractive to Adolf Hitler, who distrusted the old Prussian military elite and sought commanders who owed their loyalty to him personally rather than to tradition or class. The rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party in the early 1930s initially had little direct impact on Rommel's career. When Hitler became Chancellor in January 1933, Rommel was a major serving as an instructor. He observed the political upheaval with a detached professionalism typical of career officers who viewed politics as distinct from military duty. However, as Hitler consolidated power and began to rebuild Germany's military in defiance of the Versailles Treaty, opportunities for advancement opened up for capable officers. In 1933, Rommel was promoted to lieutenant colonel and given command of a mountain infantry battalion in Goslar. 2 years later, in 1935, he was appointed as an instructor at the War Academy in Potsdam, where he continued to refine and teach his tactical doctrines. It was also during this period that Rommel began work on a book that would eventually be published in 1937 as Infantry Attacks, a detailed account of his experiences in the First World War, with tactical analysis and lessons learned. The book was a success among military professionals and brought Rommel to wider attention within the Wehrmacht. Rommel's first significant contact with Adolf Hitler came in 1936 when he was assigned to command the Führer's bodyguard during Nazi Party rallies and events. This was not a combat assignment, but rather a ceremonial and security role, yet it brought Rommel into direct proximity with the Nazi leader. Hitler, who fancied himself a military expert and was always alert to capable commanders who lacked ties to the old aristocracy, took note of Rommel. The Führer appreciated Rommel's tactical writings and his record of personal bravery. More importantly, Hitler saw in Rommel a professional soldier who was not part of the conservative military establishment that Hitler viewed with suspicion. Over the next few years, Rommel served in various capacities, including as commandant of the War Academy at Wiener Neustadt after the annexation of Austria in 1938. During this period, his interactions with Hitler became more frequent and a mutual respect developed, though it was always a relationship between a dictator and a subordinate rather than one between equals. When Germany invaded Poland on September 1, 1939, triggering the Second World War, Rommel was initially assigned to command Hitler's personal headquarters guard. This was an important position but not a combat command, and Rommel chafed at being kept away from the fighting. He lobbied persistently for a field command, writing letters and making requests through various channels. His persistence paid off in February 1940 when he was given command of the 7th Panzer Division, despite having no prior experience with armoured formations. This appointment was controversial within the Wehrmacht, as many traditional officers believed tank divisions should be commanded by those with extensive armoured warfare training. But Hitler supported the decision, and Rommel threw himself into learning everything he could about tank tactics in the brief time before the division would be committed to action. He studied the theories of armoured warfare pioneered by Heinz Guderian and other panzer experts, adapting these concepts to his own principles of speed, aggression, and relentless pursuit. The 7th Panzer Division's performance during the Battle of France in May and June 1940 exceeded all expectations and established Rommel's reputation as one of Germany's most brilliant commanders. On May 10, 1940, German forces launched their offensive against France and the Low Countries. Rommel's division was part of the thrust through the Ardennes forest, a region the French had considered impassable for large armoured formations. Rommel drove his division forward with extraordinary speed and aggression, often positioning himself at the very front of the advance to maintain momentum. He personally led reconnaissance missions, directed tank attacks from the front lines, and made rapid tactical decisions that kept the French off balance. On May 13th, Rommel's division crossed the Meuse River at Dinant, a crucial breakthrough that helped rupture the French defensive line. In the days that followed, the 7th Panzer Division advanced so quickly that it outpaced supply lines and lost contact with headquarters on multiple occasions. Rommel earned the division the nickname Ghost Division because German high command often did not know its exact location. Throughout the French campaign, Rommel demonstrated both the strengths and weaknesses that would characterize his command style throughout the war. His aggressive pursuit of the enemy, his willingness to take risks, and his personal leadership from the front inspired his men and devastated French resistance. On one occasion, Rommel's division advanced nearly 150 miles in a single day, an extraordinary feat of mobile warfare. By June 10th, the 7th Panzer Division had reached the English Channel near Dieppe, having captured approximately 97,000 Allied prisoners, 277 artillery pieces, 64 anti-tank guns, 458 armoured vehicles and tanks, and over 4,000 transport vehicles, while suffering relatively light casualties. However, Rommel's command style also revealed troubling patterns. He frequently operated independently of orders, maintained poor communications with higher headquarters, and took risks that sometimes endangered his division. These characteristics would later contribute to both his greatest triumphs and his ultimate failures. The stunning victory in France brought Rommel significant recognition and rewards. In late 1940, he was informed that he would be given command of German forces being sent to North Africa to support Italy's faltering campaign against British forces in Libya and Egypt. On February 6, 1941, Rommel arrived in Tripoli, Libya, to take command of what would become the Deutsche Afrika Korps. His official mission was to conduct a defensive operation to prevent the complete collapse of Italian forces and maintain Axis control of Libya. However, Rommel had other ideas. After a brief assessment of the situation, he concluded that the best defense was a vigorous offense. Without waiting for all his forces to arrive and without explicit authorization from Berlin, Rommel launched an offensive on March 24, 1941, that drove British forces out of most of Libya in a matter of weeks. This audacious attack, conducted with forces far smaller than those of his opponents, stunned both the British and the German high command. British commanders who had become accustomed to easy victories over Italian forces suddenly found themselves facing a commander of extraordinary skill and daring. Over the next 18 months, the North African campaign became a contest between Rommel and a succession of British commanders, played out across the vast desert landscapes of Libya and Egypt. Rommel's tactical brilliance in desert warfare quickly became legendary. He understood how to use the terrain, how to concentrate force at decisive points, and how to exploit British weaknesses. He employed his tanks in mass formations rather than scattering them in support of infantry, used fake minefields and dummy tanks to deceive the enemy, and executed rapid flanking movements that repeatedly caught British forces off guard. The British troops, despite suffering defeats, developed a grudging respect for their opponent, referring to him as the Desert Fox for his cunning and elusiveness. Rommel's reputation grew with each victory. In June 1941, he halted a British offensive called Operation Battle Axe, destroying numerous British tanks and forcing a British retreat. In November 1941, during Operation Crusader, Rommel nearly achieved a decisive victory before being forced to withdraw due to supply shortages. The relationship between Rommel and his Italian allies was complex and often strained. While Rommel officially served under Italian command, being subordinate to Marshal Bastico and later Marshal Giovanni Messe, in practice he operated with considerable independence. He frequently ignored or circumvented Italian orders, regarding his Italian superior officers with barely concealed contempt. Rommel believed, not without justification, that Italian forces were poorly equipped and inadequately trained compared to German units. However, his dismissive attitude toward his allies created command difficulties and contributed to coordination problems that plagued Axis operations in North Africa. Some Italian units performed creditably under competent leadership, but Rommel rarely acknowledged this, preferring to rely on his German formations for critical operations. This tension between German and Italian forces would be a persistent problem throughout the North African campaign. Rommel's greatest triumph came in the summer of 1942. On May 26th, he launched Operation Venezia, an offensive aimed at capturing the British fortress of Tobruk and driving into Egypt. The operation began with a massive tank battle at Bir Hakeim and Gazala, where Rommel's forces engaged British and Free French troops in intense combat. Despite initial setbacks and heavy losses, Rommel's tactical flexibility allowed him to turn near defeat into victory. He identified weaknesses in British deployments, concentrated his armour at decisive points, and relentlessly pursued retreating enemy forces. On June 21, 1942, Tobruk fell to Axis forces, yielding 32,000 Allied prisoners and vast quantities of supplies. This was a devastating blow to British prestige and a strategic disaster. News of Tobruk's fall shocked the British government and public. For Rommel, it was the pinnacle of his career. On the same day Tobruk fell, Adolf Hitler promoted Rommel to the rank of Field Marshal, making him the youngest officer to achieve this rank in the Wehrmacht at age 50. The promotion was announced with great fanfare in Germany, and Rommel became a national hero, featured prominently in propaganda as an example of German military prowess. Following the capture of Tobruk, Rommel pushed his exhausted forces forward into Egypt, reaching El Alamein, just 60 miles from Alexandria and the Nile Delta. Here, however, the tide began to turn. British forces under General Claude Auchinleck established a defensive position between the Mediterranean Sea and the impassable Qattara Depression, a natural obstacle that prevented Rommel from executing his preferred flanking manoeuvres. In the First Battle of El Alamein in July 1942, Rommel's attacks were repulsed with heavy losses. His forces were exhausted, undersupplied, and stretched thin across hundreds of miles of desert. The logistical situation had become critical. German and Italian supply convoys crossing the Mediterranean were being sunk by British aircraft and submarines at an alarming rate. Fuel shortages meant that even when Rommel identified tactical opportunities, he often lacked the petrol to exploit them. Rommel himself fell ill with various ailments, including jaundice and desert sores, further hampering his effectiveness. In August 1942, Rommel made one last attempt to break through British lines at Alam el Halfa. The offensive was carefully planned, but British forces under their new commander, General Bernard Montgomery, had been reinforced and had benefited from intelligence intercepts that revealed German plans. Montgomery's defensive preparations were thorough, and when Rommel attacked on August 30th, he found British positions far stronger than anticipated. After several days of fierce fighting, Rommel was forced to call off the attack and withdraw. It was the first time in the North African campaign that a Rommel offensive had been clearly defeated. The failure at Alam el Halfa marked the beginning of the end for Axis forces in North Africa, though Rommel and his men did not yet know it. Rommel returned to Germany on sick leave in September, physically exhausted and suffering from various ailments. He spent several weeks recovering at home with his family, but his thoughts remained fixed on North Africa and the increasingly dire situation his forces faced. While Rommel was in Germany, the balance of power in North Africa shifted decisively against the Axis. British forces received massive reinforcements of men, tanks, artillery and aircraft, while Axis supply lines remained precarious. On October 23, 1942, Montgomery launched the Second Battle of El Alamein with overwhelming force. Rommel, still in Germany, was urgently recalled to North Africa. He arrived on October 25th to find his forces already under intense pressure from a British offensive that combined artillery bombardment, infantry assault, and armoured breakthrough. Rommel conducted a skillful defence, but he lacked the resources to do more than delay the inevitable. On November 2nd, with his forces on the verge of collapse, Rommel ordered a retreat. Hitler, in one of his increasingly common interventions in tactical matters, sent a message forbidding any withdrawal and ordering Rommel to hold his positions to the last man. Rommel initially complied, but within hours, as his front line disintegrated, he disregarded Hitler's order and resumed the retreat. This was one of the first times Rommel had directly disobeyed a Führer order, a decision that may have saved many of his soldiers, but also marked the beginning of a subtle shift in his relationship with Hitler. The retreat from El Alamein became a 1,400-mile fighting withdrawal across Libya and into Tunisia. Rommel conducted this retreat masterfully, preserving the core of his forces despite constant British pursuit and devastating air attacks. However, the strategic situation was hopeless. On November 8, 1942, just days after Rommel began his retreat, Allied forces landed in Morocco and Algeria as part of Operation Torch, opening a second front in North Africa. Axis forces were now caught between Montgomery's 8th Army, advancing from the east, and American and British forces pushing from the west. Rommel recognized that North Africa was lost and advocated for evacuation of Axis forces to Europe to preserve them for future operations. Hitler and Mussolini refused, insisting that North Africa be held at all costs. Thousands of German and Italian soldiers were poured into Tunisia in a futile attempt to maintain the Axis position. Rommel, increasingly frustrated with Hitler's strategic decisions and aware that his protests were being ignored, grew more critical of the Nazi leadership. In early 1943, Rommel attempted to achieve a spoiling victory against American forces in Tunisia. On February 14th, German forces launched an attack through the Kasserine Pass against inexperienced American troops. The attack initially achieved success, inflicting a sharp defeat on US forces and capturing significant territory and equipment. However, the offensive stalled within days as American resistance stiffened and reinforcements arrived. Rommel lacked the strength to exploit his initial success, and by February 22nd, he was forced to withdraw. The Battle of Kasserine Pass would be Rommel's last offensive victory. In the following weeks, as the Axis position in North Africa continued to deteriorate, Rommel's relationship with both his Italian superiors and the German High Command became increasingly strained. He argued vehemently for evacuation, warning that hundreds of thousands of Axis soldiers would be lost if they remained in Tunisia. His arguments fell on deaf ears. In March 1943, Rommel was recalled to Germany, officially on medical leave, but in reality because his pessimistic assessments and demands for withdrawal were unwelcome. Command of Axis forces in North Africa passed to General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim. On May 13th, 1943, the remaining Axis forces in Tunisia surrendered to the Allies. More than 250,000 German and Italian soldiers entered captivity, a disaster comparable to Stalingrad. Rommel's time in North Africa had transformed him from a successful divisional commander into a legendary figure, but it had also exposed him to the realities of Hitler's strategic incompetence and the broader moral bankruptcy of the Nazi regime. In the desert, far from the Holocaust and the worst atrocities of the Eastern Front, Rommel had been able to maintain a certain professional detachment, viewing the war as a purely military contest. However, his experiences with Hitler's refusal to authorize strategic withdrawals, his increasing awareness of the regime's disregard for the lives of German soldiers, and his exposure to the broader course of the war began to erode his loyalty. He had seen firsthand how Hitler's interference in military operations led to disaster, how the Führer's rigid demands to hold untenable positions resulted in unnecessary casualties, and how strategic resources were squandered due to ideological obstinacy rather than military necessity. These experiences planted seeds of doubt that would grow in the months to come. After returning from North Africa, Rommel spent several months in Germany, where he was treated as a national hero despite the ultimate defeat in North Africa. He was used extensively for propaganda purposes, meeting with Hitler on several occasions and being featured in newsreels and public events. During this period, Rommel had time to reflect on the war's progress and Germany's strategic situation. He could see that Germany was now fighting a multi-front war against enemies with vastly superior industrial and manpower resources. The tide had turned decisively against Germany on all fronts. The Wehrmacht had been defeated at Stalingrad, driven from North Africa, and was in retreat in the Soviet Union. Allied bombing was devastating German cities. Italy, Germany's principal ally, was on the verge of collapse. Yet Hitler and the Nazi leadership showed no inclination towards seeking a negotiated peace or making realistic strategic adjustments. Instead, they spoke of secret weapons and final victory, promises that Rommel increasingly viewed as delusions. In July 1943, Rommel was appointed commander of Army Group B in northern Italy, tasked with defending against an anticipated Allied invasion following the Allied conquest of Sicily. However, Italy's military situation quickly deteriorated. On July 25, 1943, Benito Mussolini was overthrown by his own fascist Grand Council and arrested. The new Italian government under Marshal Pietro Badoglio began secret negotiations with the Allies while publicly claiming continued loyalty to Germany. Rommel was ordered to prepare for the possibility of Italian defection and to secure strategic positions throughout northern Italy. When Italy signed an armistice with the Allies on September 8, 1943, German forces implemented Operation AXA, disarming Italian troops and taking control of key positions. Rommel's forces in northern Italy efficiently executed these operations, though the sight of former allies being disarmed and in many cases imprisoned troubled him. The collapse of Italy meant that Germany now faced yet another active front, further stretching already overextended resources. In November 1943, Rommel received new orders that would place him at the centre of Germany's most critical defensive operation. He was appointed Inspector of Atlantic Wall Defences, responsible for assessing and strengthening German fortifications along the coast of France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. The Allied invasion of Western Europe was anticipated for some time in 1944, and Hitler tasked Rommel with ensuring that German defences could repel the attack. Rommel threw himself into this assignment with characteristic energy. He toured hundreds of miles of coastline, inspecting fortifications, questioning officers, and developing plans for defensive improvements. What he found appalled him. Despite years of construction and propaganda claims about an impregnable Atlantic wall, the defences were incomplete, inconsistently built, and in many sectors woefully inadequate. Beach obstacles were insufficient, minefields were poorly laid, and many positions lacked proper fields of fire or supporting defensive works. Rommel immediately began implementing improvements based on his extensive combat experience. He ordered the construction of millions of beach obstacles designed to destroy landing craft and tanks before they could reach the shore. He demanded massive increases in minefield density, including underwater mines, anti-personnel mines, and anti-tank mines. He ordered the flooding of low-lying areas to create obstacles and limit the routes attackers could use. He had thousands of wooden stakes embedded in open fields to prevent glider landings. He fortified villages and towns, creating strong points that could serve as anchors for the defence. He worked to improve the coastal artillery positions and to ensure that every possible landing beach was covered by defensive fire. The scale of work was enormous, requiring millions of man-hours and vast quantities of materials. Progress was hindered by shortages of everything from concrete to barbed wire to skilled labour. Nevertheless, under Rommel's driving leadership, the defences improved significantly during the winter and spring of 1943 to 1944. However, Rommel faced a fundamental strategic disagreement with other senior German commanders, particularly Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, who was the overall Commander-in-Chief West. Rommel believed that the Allied invasion had to be defeated on the beaches in the first hours of the landing. He argued that Allied air superiority would make it impossible to move large armoured reserves to the invasion site once the landing had occurred. Therefore, panzer divisions needed to be positioned close to the coast, ready to counterattack immediately. Rundstedt and others, including Panzer Commander General Leo Geyer von Schweppenburg, disagreed. They believed the proper strategy was to hold armoured reserves inland, determine where the main Allied effort was being made, and then launch a concentrated counterattack with massed armour. This fundamental disagreement over doctrine meant that when the invasion came, German armoured forces were divided and unable to execute either strategy effectively. Hitler characteristically refused to clearly resolve the dispute, instead compromising in a way that satisfied no one and weakened the overall defence. During the months leading up to the invasion, Rommel's interactions with Hitler became increasingly strained. In meetings and written reports, Rommel pressed for more resources, more authority, and more realistic strategic planning. He argued that Germany's position was becoming untenable and that the leadership needed to seek a political settlement before the situation became catastrophic. These views were not well received. Hitler became irritated with Rommel's pessimism and began to question whether the famed Desert Fox had lost his nerve. Other Nazi leaders, particularly Heinrich Himmler and Joseph Goebbels, grew suspicious of Rommel's loyalty. Nevertheless, Rommel's reputation with the German public and his status as a military hero provided him with a degree of protection. He was too valuable as a propaganda symbol to be discarded, even if his actual military advice was increasingly ignored. This paradox placed Rommel in a difficult position. He could see the disasters approaching, felt a duty to warn the leadership, but found his warnings dismissed as defeatism. On the night of June 5, 1944, Rommel was not at his headquarters in northern France. He had travelled to Germany to celebrate his wife Lucy's birthday on June 6th and to meet with Hitler to request additional resources for the Atlantic Wall defences. Weather forecasts predicted several days of storms in the English Channel, making an invasion seem unlikely in the immediate future. This assessment proved catastrophic. In the early hours of June 6th, Allied airborne forces began landing in Normandy, followed at dawn by the largest amphibious invasion in history. By the time Rommel learned of the invasion and raced back to France, thousands of Allied troops were already ashore, and the critical first hours of the battle had passed, the very scenario he had warned against. An Allied foothold that could not be immediately eliminated had come to pass. Rommel arrived at his headquarters on the evening of June 6th to find confusion, contradictory reports, and a developing catastrophe. In the days following D-Day, Rommel worked frantically to organise an effective defence and counterattack. However, he faced impossible circumstances. Allied air superiority was even more devastating than he had predicted. German units attempting to move to the front were subjected to constant air attack, suffering heavy casualties and delays. The panzer divisions that Rommel had wanted positioned near the coast were scattered inland and required days to reach the battlefield, arriving piecemeal rather than in the concentrated force needed for a decisive counterattack. Hitler continued to interfere, issuing orders that made no tactical sense and forbidding retreats even from untenable positions. Rommel found himself fighting not just the Allies but also the incompetence and rigidity of his own high command. He visited frontline units constantly, exposing himself to danger in attempts to inspire his troops and assess the situation firsthand. What he saw confirmed his worst fears. The Allies were bringing overwhelming force to bear. German casualties were mounting without corresponding Allied losses, and there was no realistic prospect of driving the invaders back into the sea. By late June, Rommel had concluded that the battle for Normandy was lost and that Germany's position in France was untenable. On June 29th, he met with Rundstedt to discuss the situation. Both field marshals agreed that the military situation was hopeless and that political action was necessary. When they reported this assessment to Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, Hitler's chief of staff, they were asked what should be done. Rundstedt reportedly replied with brutal honesty, "Make peace, you fools! What else can you do?" This outburst led to Rundstedt's dismissal days later, replaced by Field Marshal Günther von Kluge. Rommel submitted his own assessment in writing to Hitler on July 15, 1944. In this report, Rommel laid out the stark military reality in unsparing detail. German forces were being ground down by superior Allied material and air power. Reinforcements could not reach the front or arrive too weakened to be effective. The front would inevitably collapse within weeks. The report concluded with an unmistakable political message, stating that the troops were fighting heroically, but that the unequal struggle was approaching its end, and urging Hitler to draw the appropriate conclusions from this situation. This report was as close as Rommel had yet come to openly suggesting that Germany should seek peace. Hitler's response was to ignore the military assessment and to send a message reiterating that every inch of ground must be held. For Rommel, this confirmed what he had increasingly suspected, that Hitler was either unable or unwilling to face reality, and that Germany under Nazi leadership was doomed to fight until completely destroyed. This realization forced Rommel to confront a profound question. As a German officer and patriot, what was his duty when the leadership was leading the nation to ruin? Traditional military ethics held that soldiers obeyed lawful orders and did not engage in politics. But what if obedience meant complicity in Germany's destruction? What if the only way to save Germany was to remove Hitler from power? These were not abstract questions for Rommel in the summer of 1944. They were immediate and personal dilemmas that demanded resolution. It was during this period that Rommel began to have cautious conversations with individuals who opposed Hitler. The nature and extent of Rommel's involvement with the German resistance movement remains one of the most debated questions of World War II history. What is certain is that various members of the resistance approached Rommel in the months before and after D-Day, seeking to gauge his willingness to support action against Hitler. Among those who had contact with Rommel were Dr. Karl Strölin, the mayor of Stuttgart, and an old friend from Rommel's World War I service, and Lieutenant Colonel Caesar von Hofacker, a cousin of Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg. These men and others carefully sounded out Rommel's views, speaking in careful language about Germany's future and the need for change in leadership. Rommel listened and, according to later testimony, indicated sympathy with the idea that Hitler must be removed from power for Germany to survive. However, Rommel's conception of how this should happen differed significantly from that of the core conspirators. Rommel believed that Hitler should be arrested and brought to trial before a German court to answer for his crimes and his disastrous leadership. He opposed assassination, partly on moral grounds and partly because he feared that killing Hitler would make him a martyr and provoke a civil war between Nazi loyalists and the resistance. Rommel envisioned a scenario in which the army would arrest Hitler and the top Nazi leadership, establish a military government, and immediately seek an armistice with the Western Allies while continuing to fight the Soviet Union in the East. This plan was strategically naive, as the Allies had committed to unconditional surrender and would not negotiate a separate peace with any German government, but it reflected Rommel's worldview. He saw Nazism as a catastrophe and Hitler as a destructive force, but he also retained traditional conservative and nationalist views about Germany's place in Europe. His opposition to Hitler was pragmatic and patriotic, rather than fundamentally ideological. He did not fully grasp the moral dimension of Nazi crimes, particularly the Holocaust, having been largely isolated from the regime's worst atrocities during his years commanding in North Africa and France. The exact degree of Rommel's commitment to the resistance conspiracy remains unclear because events overtook the plotters before any clear agreement was reached. On July 17, 1944, 3 days before the planned assassination attempt, Rommel's staff car was strafed by Allied fighter bombers on a road near Sainte-Foy-de-Montgomery in Normandy. The driver was killed, and the car crashed. Rommel suffered severe injuries including a fractured skull, injuries to his left eye and cheekbone, and concussion. He was rushed to a hospital and then, after several days, transported back to Germany to recover. The severe head injuries put Rommel out of action at the critical moment, removing him from the events that would seal his fate. Had Rommel been healthy and at his headquarters on July 20, 1944, he might have played a decisive role in the conspiracy. As it was, he lay unconscious in a hospital bed while history unfolded without him. On July 20, 1944, Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg placed a bomb in a briefing room at Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia, the Wolf's Lair. The bomb exploded, killing 4 men and wounding others, but Hitler survived with relatively minor injuries. The carefully planned coup that was supposed to follow the assassination failed due to confusion, hesitation, and Hitler's survival. Within hours, the conspiracy began to unravel as loyalist forces regained control in Berlin and other cities. In the days and weeks that followed, the Gestapo launched a massive investigation to identify everyone involved in or aware of the plot. Hundreds of people were arrested, interrogated under torture, and many were executed. The investigation quickly revealed that members of Rommel's staff, including his chief of staff, Hans Speidel, and Lieutenant Colonel Caesar von Hofacker, had been in contact with the conspirators. Under interrogation, Hofacker mentioned conversations with Rommel, though accounts differ as to exactly what he said and whether it directly implicated Rommel. Hitler's reaction to the evidence connecting Rommel to the conspiracy was complex. On one hand, Rommel was one of Germany's most famous military leaders, a field marshal whose name and reputation were valuable propaganda assets. Publicly trying and executing Rommel would be a devastating admission that even Hitler's most celebrated commanders had turned against him. It would damage military morale and provide fodder for Allied propaganda. On the other hand, Hitler was paranoid and furious about the July 20th plot, demanding vengeance against anyone involved. The Gestapo and the SS, particularly Heinrich Himmler, wanted Rommel prosecuted. They had never trusted him and saw an opportunity to eliminate a potential rival. Hitler was also influenced by Martin Bormann and others who suggested that Rommel's defeatism and pessimistic reports had undermined German war efforts. For several months, as Rommel slowly recovered from his injuries at his home in Herrlingen, his fate hung in the balance. He was under Gestapo surveillance but had not been arrested. He knew that many of his associates had been taken into custody and executed, and he must have suspected that his own reckoning would come. During his convalescence, Rommel had time to reflect on his career, his relationship with Hitler, and the path that had led him to this point. He was attended by his wife Lucy and his son Manfred, now 15 years old, and by a small group of loyal staff members. Visitors were monitored, his telephone was tapped, and Gestapo agents watched the house. Despite his injuries and the surveillance, Rommel remained mentally sharp and fully aware of his precarious situation. He discussed with close associates what he would do if arrested. According to later accounts, he indicated that he would not allow himself to be subjected to a show trial, and that he would find a way to end his life rather than give the regime that satisfaction. He also expressed concern for his family, knowing that the Nazi regime often punished the families of accused traitors. The doctrine of Sippenhaft, kin and liability, meant that Lucy and Manfred could face imprisonment or worse if Rommel was convicted of treason. This concern for his family's safety would prove decisive in the final days of his life. By early October 1944, Hitler had made his decision. Rommel would not be publicly tried. Instead, he would be given a choice. If he committed suicide, his death would be announced as resulting from his injuries from the July 17th strafing attack. He would receive a state funeral with full military honours. His family would be protected and would retain his pension and estates. His reputation would remain intact. If he refused and insisted on a trial, he would be arrested, brought before the People's Court, convicted, and executed. His family would be arrested and subjected to persecution. His name would be dragged through the mud as a traitor. There was no third option. This ultimatum was to be delivered personally by two generals who would ensure that Rommel understood the terms and the consequences. The men chosen for this grim task were General Wilhelm Burgdorf, Hitler's chief adjutant, and General Ernst Meisel, both convinced Nazis who could be trusted to carry out Hitler's order without wavering. On the morning of October 14, 1944, Rommel was at his home in Herrlingen, still recovering from his injuries but physically much improved. He had been promoted to the rank of Field Marshal and was theoretically still on the active list, though he had not received any new assignment. Just before noon, Rommel received a telephone call informing him that Generals Burgdorf and Meisel would be arriving shortly to speak with him. Rommel understood immediately what this meant. He had been expecting something like this, though the final confirmation that his time had come still struck him with force. He called his son Manfred and his aide, Captain Hermann Aldinger, into his study and told them that he had been accused of participating in the July 20th plot and that Hitler was offering him the choice of suicide or trial. Rommel's voice was calm as he explained the situation, but the anguish was evident. He told them that he had been given 10 minutes to decide once the generals arrived. He stated that he would choose suicide to protect his family and preserve his reputation for the sake of his soldiers who still believed in him. When Burgdorf and Meisel arrived, they spent approximately an hour with Rommel in his study. The exact conversation is not known as no transcript exists, but based on later accounts from family members who spoke with Rommel afterward, the generals presented the formal accusation and ultimatum. Rommel was accused of having had prior knowledge of the July 20th plot, of having been in contact with the conspirators, and of having agreed that he would play a role in a new government after Hitler's removal. The evidence came primarily from statements made under interrogation by Hofacker and Speidel, though how much of this evidence was genuine confession versus coerced testimony extracted under torture remains disputed. Rommel apparently denied direct involvement in planning the assassination, but acknowledged that he had been approached by conspirators and had expressed sympathy for removing Hitler from power. Whether this constituted treason in the legal sense was debatable, but in the political atmosphere of October 1944, with Hitler paranoid and vengeful after the July 20th plot, legal niceties were irrelevant. The verdict had already been determined. The only question was how Rommel would die. After the generals finished presenting the charges and ultimatum, they left Rommel alone to make his decision. He spent a few minutes with his wife and son, explaining what he had to do and why. Lucy was devastated, and Manfred later recalled that his father appeared resigned but composed. Rommel told them that he believed it was his duty to accept suicide to protect them and to prevent his name from being dishonoured in a show trial. He emphasised that he had done nothing of which he was ashamed, that he had served Germany to the best of his ability, and that his criticism of Hitler's leadership had been motivated by love of country and concern for German soldiers. He expressed no regret for opposing Hitler's catastrophic policies, only sadness that Germany was being destroyed and that he would not live to see its recovery. He embraced his wife and son, put on his Afrika Korps leather jacket, a symbol of his glory days, and walked out of the house to the waiting car where Bergdorf and Maisel sat. Rommel got into the back seat of the car, and it drove a short distance from the house. According to the official account provided by Bergdorf and Maisel, as well as later historical investigation, Rommel was given a cyanide capsule, which he swallowed. Within minutes, the poison took effect, and Erwin Rommel, Field Marshal, hero of the Africa Campaign, and one of the most skilled commanders of the Second World War, was dead. He was 52 years old. The car carrying his body returned to the house. An SS doctor examined the body and pronounced Rommel dead, attributing the death to embolism related to his earlier injuries, the agreed-upon cover story. Lucy and Manfred were brought to see the body. They were not allowed to have an independent autopsy. The regime kept its side of the bargain. Hitler announced Rommel's death as a loss to the German nation, attributing it to injuries sustained in action. A state funeral was arranged for October 18th in Ulm, with full military honours. The funeral was a grand affair, carefully orchestrated to serve the regime's propaganda needs. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt delivered the eulogy, speaking of Rommel's bravery, tactical genius, and devotion to Germany. He made no mention of the true circumstances of death, maintaining the fiction that Rommel had succumbed to his wounds. Thousands attended the ceremony, including high-ranking military officers and Nazi officials. Hitler did not attend but sent a wreath. The entire spectacle was filmed and photographed for newsreels and propaganda publications. For the Nazi regime, Rommel's funeral served multiple purposes. It demonstrated that even in Germany's darkest hour, the regime honoured its heroes. It provided a morale boost to troops and civilians. Most importantly, it obscured the reality that the regime had just murdered one of its most celebrated generals for disloyalty. The truth about Rommel's forced suicide was known to only a small circle of people, and they were sworn to secrecy on pain of death. Lucy and Manfred Rommel were indeed protected as promised. They were not arrested or persecuted. They retained the family home and Erwin's pension. However, they lived under the shadow of terrible knowledge. Lucy knew that her husband had been murdered by the regime he had served, but she could not speak of it publicly. The trauma of October 14th, 1944, would mark her for the rest of her life. Manfred, who had witnessed his father's final moments, carried the burden of knowing how Erwin Rommel truly died. He would later write about these events, but not until after the war, when it was safe to reveal the truth. In the final months of the war, as Germany collapsed and the Nazi regime disintegrated, Lucy and Manfred survived the chaos. They were in Herrlingen when French forces occupied the area in April 1945. Unlike many German families associated with the Nazi regime, they were treated respectfully by the occupation forces, partly because by that time, the truth about Rommel's death had begun to emerge and he was viewed as a victim of Hitler rather than a willing Nazi accomplice. In the decades following the war, Rommel's reputation underwent a complex evolution, immediately after the war, as the full extent of Nazi crimes became known, and as the Nuremberg trials exposed the criminal nature of the regime, there was a tendency in some quarters to portray all German military leaders as complicit in Nazi atrocities. However, Rommel's case was different. The revelation that he had been forced to commit suicide for opposing Hitler, combined with his relatively clean record regarding war crimes, led to a process of rehabilitation. Former Allied commanders who had fought against Rommel, including Bernard Montgomery and George Patton, spoke respectfully of his military abilities and character. British military historians began to study Rommel's campaigns as examples of tactical excellence. The narrative developed that Rommel had been a good German, a professional soldier who had served his country but had ultimately recognized Hitler's evil and paid the ultimate price for that recognition. This narrative, often called the Rommel myth, became particularly pronounced during the Cold War. West Germany, now an ally of the Western powers against the Soviet Union, needed historical figures who could represent a Germany that was distinct from the Nazi regime. Rommel, with his military brilliance, his alleged opposition to Hitler, and his forced suicide, fit this need perfectly. Streets, barracks, and military installations were named after him. His son Manfred became a prominent politician, eventually serving as mayor of Stuttgart for over 2 decades. Books, films, and documentaries portrayed Rommel as a tragic hero, a man of honour, trapped in the service of an evil regime. The 1951 film The Desert Fox, starring James Mason, presented this interpretation to a wide audience, depicting Rommel as a noble warrior who turned against Hitler. This romanticized version of Rommel became deeply embedded in popular culture and historical memory. However, beginning in the 1980s and accelerating in subsequent decades, historians began to subject the Rommel myth to critical examination. Research revealed complexities and contradictions that the earlier heroic narrative had glossed over. Yes, Rommel had been forced to commit suicide, and yes, he had expressed opposition to Hitler's leadership in the final year of his life. But what about the preceding years? Rommel had been an enthusiastic supporter of Hitler and the Nazi regime throughout the 1930s and much of the 1940s. He had benefited enormously from Hitler's patronage, receiving rapid promotions and prestigious commands. He had been happy to be used for propaganda purposes, allowing himself to be portrayed as the exemplary Nazi general. His vaunted military brilliance had been employed in service of a war of aggression and conquest, while Rommel's forces in North Africa were generally regarded as having fought a clean war, meaning they did not engage in the systematic atrocities that characterized German operations on the Eastern Front. This was partly due to the nature of the North African theatre, rather than any principled opposition to Nazi ideology on Rommel's part. Moreover, the extent of Rommel's actual involvement with the resistance remained questionable. Unlike some conspirators who had actively plotted against Hitler for years, Rommel's opposition was late, hesitant, and conditional. He had expressed criticism of Hitler's leadership and had listened sympathetically to resistance emissaries, but he had not taken concrete steps to organize or participate in the coup. His conception of removing Hitler through arrest and trial rather than assassination was strategically naive and arguably self-serving, allowing him to position himself as opposing Hitler while avoiding the moral responsibility of tyrannicide. Some historians argued that Rommel's opposition to Hitler was purely pragmatic, driven by recognition that the war was lost rather than by any fundamental moral objection to Nazism. He had been perfectly content with the regime when it was winning. It was only when defeat loomed that he became a critic. This interpretation cast Rommel not as a hero of resistance, but as an opportunist who turned on Hitler only when the cause was hopeless. The debate over Rommel's true character and motivations exemplifies broader questions about how we judge historical figures, particularly those associated with morally compromised regimes. Should Rommel be evaluated primarily as a military commander, judged on his tactical skills and conduct in battle? Or should he be assessed as a participant in the Nazi system, regardless of his personal views or later opposition? How much credit should he receive for his final break with Hitler, and how much should that be discounted by the timing and circumstances? These are not easy questions, and honest historians disagree on the answers. What seems clear is that Rommel was neither the pure hero of the post-war myth, nor the willing Nazi accomplice that some critics have portrayed. He was a complex, contradictory figure whose life and death illuminate the moral ambiguities that war and dictatorship create. One aspect of Rommel's story that bears particular attention is his evolution from loyal Hitler supporter to regime critic. This was not a sudden conversion, but a gradual process driven by accumulating experiences and disappointments. In the 1930s, Rommel genuinely admired Hitler, viewing him as a strong leader who had restored German pride and rebuilt the military. Rommel was not a member of the Nazi Party, but this was more due to military regulations discouraging party membership than to any principled objection. He accepted Nazi ideology in its broad outlines, sharing its nationalism, its contempt for democracy, and its belief in German superiority. He had no objection to the regime's anti-Semitic laws, its suppression of political opposition, or its territorial expansion. When he commanded Hitler's bodyguard at party rallies, he performed the duty with pride, not reluctance. When he wrote Infantry Attacks, he dedicated it to Hitler. These were not the actions of a man who harbored deep reservations about the regime. The war years, particularly 1940 to 1942, reinforced Rommel's positive view of Hitler and the Nazi system. The stunning victories in France and the early successes in North Africa seemed to vindicate Hitler's leadership and Germany's military superiority. Rommel basked in the acclaim and advancement that came with these victories. His promotion to Field Marshal at age 50, an extraordinary achievement for someone of non-aristocratic background, was a direct result of Hitler's favour. During this period, Rommel's loyalty to Hitler was not merely dutiful but genuine. He believed in the cause for which he fought, even if his focus was primarily military rather than ideological. The beginning of Rommel's disillusionment can be traced to late 1942 and 1943, as the tide of war turned and Hitler's interference in military operations became increasingly destructive. The order to hold positions at El Alamein, despite the tactical impossibility, the refusal to authorize the evacuation of North Africa, the insistence on defending every inch of Tunisia until hundreds of thousands of soldiers were captured, these decisions struck Rommel as militarily insane and morally unconscionable. What transformed Rommel's disillusionment with Hitler's military leadership into something approaching political opposition was the recognition that Hitler's strategic incompetence was rooted in ideological fanaticism. Hitler was not simply making bad military decisions. He was pursuing a delusional vision of final victory based on will and racial superiority rather than realistic assessment of Germany's strategic situation. Moreover, Hitler's willingness to sacrifice hundreds of thousands of German soldiers for symbolic or ideological objectives rather than military necessity revealed a callous disregard for German lives that offended Rommel's sense of duty and honor. By 1944, Rommel had concluded that Hitler was leading Germany to destruction and that the only way to save the nation and its people was to remove Hitler from power. This was not yet a fully developed moral rejection of Nazism, but it was a decisive break with personal loyalty to Hitler. Rommel's tragedy was that he reached this conclusion too late to act effectively. Had he made this break in 1942 or 1943, he might have played a significant role in organizing military opposition to Hitler. By mid-1944, the military situation had deteriorated to the point where even successful removal of Hitler would likely not have altered Germany's ultimate defeat. The question of what would have happened if Rommel had survived, and if the July 20th plot had succeeded, is endlessly fascinating but ultimately speculative. Would Rommel have participated in a post-Hitler government? Almost certainly, given his prominence and his expressed willingness to play such a role. Would such a government have been able to negotiate a peace with the Allies? Highly unlikely, given the Allies' commitment to unconditional surrender and their determination to utterly defeat Nazi Germany. Would Rommel have faced war crimes prosecution? Possibly, though his relatively clean record and his role in opposing Hitler might have spared him the fate of other German generals. Would he have later played a role in rebuilding democratic Germany? Perhaps, though his conservative nationalist views might have made him an awkward fit in the new political order. These counterfactuals, while interesting, cannot be resolved. History unfolded as it did. Rommel died on October 14, 1944, murdered by the regime he had served, having belatedly recognized that regime's destructive nature, but too late to effectively oppose it. The title betrayed in reference to Rommel's relationship with Hitler is itself complex and depends on perspective. From Hitler's viewpoint, Rommel had indeed betrayed him by losing faith in his leadership, by sympathizing with conspirators who sought to remove him from power, and by advocating for peace. When Hitler demanded continued resistance, the evidence that led to Rommel's forced suicide, while perhaps not legally sufficient for a fair trial, was enough to convince Hitler that Rommel could no longer be trusted. From Rommel's perspective, the betrayal ran in the opposite direction. He had given his loyalty and service to Hitler and to Germany, had fought brilliantly for years, had risked his life repeatedly, and had achieved remarkable victories. In return, Hitler had ignored his military council, had made decisions that cost tens of thousands of German lives unnecessarily, had refused to face strategic reality, and ultimately had ordered his murder. In Rommel's eyes, it was Hitler who had betrayed Germany by leading it to ruin, and who had betrayed the soldiers who trusted in his leadership. This clash of perspectives on who betrayed whom reveals the fundamental incompatibility between professional military ethics and totalitarian political demands. To fully understand Rommel's trajectory from loyal Hitler supporter to regime critic, it is essential to place his story in the broader context of German military resistance to Hitler. Rommel was far from the only senior German officer who came to recognize Hitler's destructive leadership and who contemplated or participated in efforts to remove him from power. Throughout the Nazi period, there existed within the German military a faction of officers who opposed Hitler on various grounds, ranging from traditional conservative objections to Nazi radicalism, to pragmatic concerns about Hitler's strategic decision-making, to genuine moral revulsion at Nazi crimes. However, this opposition was always a minority view within the officer corps, and it faced enormous obstacles, including the oath of loyalty that all officers had sworn to Hitler personally, the pervasive surveillance and suspicion of the Gestapo and SS, and the very real fear of brutal consequences for anyone caught in acts of resistance. The history of German military resistance to Hitler is a history of hesitation, failed attempts, and ultimately tragic failure. The earliest military opposition to Hitler emerged in the late 1930s among certain officers who feared that Hitler's aggressive foreign policy would lead Germany into a catastrophic war. General Ludwig Beck, chief of the General Staff until his resignation in 1938, was one of the earliest and most principled opponents of Hitler within the military. Beck believed that Hitler's plans to invade Czechoslovakia and later Poland would trigger a wider European war that Germany could not win. He attempted to organize resistance among senior generals, hoping to stage a coup if Hitler ordered an invasion of Czechoslovakia. However, this plan collapsed when Britain and France agreed to the Munich Agreement in September 1938, allowing Hitler to annex the Sudetenland without war. Hitler's diplomatic triumph undermined the opposition, making Beck and his allies appear to have been needlessly alarmist. After his resignation, Beck remained a central figure in the resistance, but without official position, his ability to influence events was limited. He would later become the designated head of state for the post-Hitler government, planned by the July 20th conspirators, but he died by suicide after the plot's failure. Another early opponent of Hitler was Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, head of the Abwehr, German military intelligence. Canaris had become disillusioned with the Nazi regime's brutality and gradually shifted from dutiful service to covert opposition. Under his leadership, the Abwehr became a haven for resistance sympathizers and a center for collecting evidence of Nazi atrocities. Canaris used his position to warn foreign governments about German attack plans, to shield Jews and other persecuted individuals, and to support resistance activities. However, Canaris's opposition was cautious and indirect. He did not actively plot against Hitler but rather worked to sabotage or mitigate Nazi policies where possible. After the July 20th plot, Canaris's connections to the resistance were discovered and he was arrested. He was executed in April 1945, just weeks before the war's end, at Flossenbürg concentration camp. His death, along with that of his deputy Hans Oster and others, represented the final destruction of the Abwehr resistance network. The most serious attempt to remove Hitler before the July 20th, 1944 plot came in March 1943, known as Operation Flash. The plan involved placing a bomb on Hitler's aircraft during a visit to Army Group Center headquarters in Smolensk. The conspirators, including Major General Henning von Treschow and his aide Lieutenant Fabian von Schlabrendorf, managed to plant the device, but the bomb failed to explode due to a faulty detonator affected by the cold temperatures in the aircraft's cargo hold. A week later, another attempt was made by Colonel Rudolf Christoph von Gersdorf, who volunteered to commit a suicide bombing during Hitler's visit to an exhibition in Berlin. However, Hitler left the exhibition much earlier than scheduled, thwarting the attempt. These near misses demonstrated both the determination of some resistance members and the enormous practical difficulties of assassinating Hitler, who was protected by extensive security measures and whose schedule was often changed unpredictably. The July 20th, 1944 plot represented the culmination of years of resistance planning and the last realistic chance to remove Hitler before Germany's total defeat. The conspiracy involved a broad network of military officers, civil servants, and civilians from various backgrounds. The military participants included General Friedrich Olbricht, who held a key position in the reserve army that would allow mobilization of troops for the coup, General Erich Höppner, a former panzer commander who had been dismissed by Hitler in 1942, and numerous other officers at various levels of command. The civilian participants included Karl Goerdeler, former mayor of Leipzig, who was designated to become chancellor in the post-Hitler government, and Helmuth James von Moltke, a lawyer who led the Kreisau Circle, a resistance discussion group. The plot's military leader was Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, a decorated officer who had lost his right hand, 2 fingers of his left hand, and his left eye in combat in North Africa, and who had access to Hitler's headquarters as chief of staff of the replacement army. The plan was for Stauffenberg to place a bomb near Hitler during a briefing at the Wolf's Lair, then fly to Berlin to lead the coup. Once Hitler was dead, Operation Valkyrie, an existing contingency plan for dealing with internal unrest, would be activated under false pretenses. Reserve army units would be mobilized to seize control of government buildings, arrest Nazi officials, and secure communications. The plan required precise coordination and decisive action. What actually happened on July 20th was a series of unfortunate accidents and critical hesitations that doomed the conspiracy. Stauffenberg successfully planted the bomb, but the briefing was moved from Hitler's bunker to a wooden building, reducing the explosive force. Moreover, another officer inadvertently moved the briefcase containing the bomb to the other side of a heavy table support, shielding Hitler from the worst of the blast. The bomb exploded as planned, killing 4 men, but Hitler survived with minor injuries. Stauffenberg, believing Hitler was dead, flew to Berlin to initiate the coup. However, in Berlin, the conspirators hesitated. General Friedrich Fromm, commander of the replacement army, refused to join the coup and eventually ordered the arrest of the conspirators. Key communications were not secured quickly enough, allowing Hitler to broadcast to the nation that he had survived and crushing any uncertainty about the situation. By evening, Loyalist forces had regained control in Berlin. Stauffenberg and several other conspirators were arrested and executed by firing squad that same night. In the weeks and months that followed, the Gestapo arrested thousands of people connected to the plot or suspected of resistance sympathies. Trials before the People's Court, presided over by the fanatical Nazi judge Roland Freisler, resulted in death sentences for hundreds of individuals. Many were executed by hanging with piano wire from meat hooks, their deaths filmed for Hitler's viewing. The suppression of the July 20th plot was savage and thorough, effectively destroying organized resistance to Hitler within Germany for the remainder of the war. Rommel's connection to this network of resistance was peripheral and late developing compared to figures like Beck, Treschow, or Stauffenberg. He had not been part of the resistance circles in the late 1930s or early 1940s. His involvement came only in 1944, when his disillusionment with Hitler had reached a breaking point and when conspirators approached him hoping to win his support, or at least his acquiescence to their plans. The evidence suggests that Rommel was sympathetic to the goal of removing Hitler, but had serious reservations about the means and the timing. His preference for arresting rather than killing Hitler reflected both moral scruples and political calculation. Rommel believed that Hitler brought to trial and convicted of his crimes would delegitimize Nazism in a way that Hitler killed in an explosion might not. He also feared that assassination would trigger civil war between Nazi loyalists and the resistance. Whether these concerns were realistic is debatable, but they were sincerely held. The fate that befell Rommel was not unique among German field marshals suspected of disloyalty or defeatism, though the specific circumstances of his death were distinctive. Several other senior commanders faced punishment or dismissal for perceived failures or for questioning Hitler's leadership. Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, who commanded Army Group Center during the invasion of the Soviet Union, was relieved of command twice by Hitler, first in December 1941 and again in July 1942, for conducting retreats without authorization. Unlike Rommel, Bock was not implicated in the July 20th plot, but he shared Rommel's experience of being a brilliant commander whose relationship with Hitler was poisoned by strategic disagreements. Bock died in May 1945 when British aircraft strafed his car, an ironic parallel to Rommel's injuries from an Allied air attack. Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, who replaced Rommel as commander in France after Rommel's injury, fell under suspicion due to his connections with resistance members. After the July 20th plot, Hitler suspected Kluge of sympathizing with the conspirators. On August 17, 1944, Kluge committed suicide by taking cyanide rather than face interrogation and probable execution, leaving a letter for Hitler that mixed protestations of loyalty. With criticism of Hitler's military leadership, Field Marshal Erwin von Witzleben, unlike Rommel, was an active participant in the July 20th conspiracy. He had been designated to become Commander-in-Chief of the Wehrmacht in the post-Hitler government. Witzleben had opposed Hitler since before the war and had been involved in earlier resistance plots. After the failure of the July 20th attempt, Witzleben was arrested, tried before the People's Court, and executed by hanging on August 8, 1944. His trial was a show proceeding in which he was not permitted to present a defense and was subjected to verbal abuse by Judge Freisler. The contrast between Witzleben's fate and Rommel's illustrates Hitler's different treatment of those he viewed as active traitors versus those whose disloyalty was more ambiguous. Witzleben was publicly tried and executed as an example and a warning. Rommel, whose involvement was less clear and whose public image was more valuable to the regime, was given the option of quiet suicide to avoid a scandal. Both men ended up dead, but the manner of their deaths reflected Hitler's cold calculation of propaganda value and political expediency. Among the field marshals who remained loyal to Hitler until the end, fates varied considerably. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, Hitler's chief military advisor, remained absolutely loyal throughout the war and was one of the signatories of Germany's unconditional surrender in May 1945. He was arrested by the Allies, tried at Nuremberg for war crimes and crimes against peace, convicted and executed by hanging in October 1946. His steadfast loyalty to Hitler did not save him from the gallows. Field Marshal Alfred Jodl, Chief of Operations Staff, similarly remained loyal and signed surrender documents. He too was tried at Nuremberg, convicted and executed. The post-war trials made no distinction between those who had served Hitler competently and those who had opposed him. What mattered to Allied prosecutors was participation in an aggressive war and complicity in war crimes, not internal German political alignments. Ironically, Rommel's forced suicide may have spared him from facing Allied justice, a point sometimes made by those who argue that his death was not entirely tragic from his perspective. The moral questions raised by Rommel's story extend beyond the specific historical circumstances to broader issues about duty, obedience, and resistance under dictatorship. Military culture traditionally emphasizes obedience to lawful authority and political neutrality. Soldiers are expected to follow orders from civilian leadership and to execute their military duties without engaging in political activity. This framework works reasonably well in democratic societies, with constitutional protections and legal constraints on governmental power. But what happens when the government is a dictatorship that wages aggressive war and commits atrocities? Do military officers have a duty to obey even criminal orders? Do they have a moral obligation to resist or even to attempt to overthrow such a government? These are not merely academic questions. They are intensely practical dilemmas that countless officers have faced in various contexts throughout history. Rommel's case illustrates both the personal agony of such dilemmas and the terrible consequences that can follow from either compliance or resistance. One perspective on Rommel's behavior is that he failed in his moral duty by serving Hitler for as long as he did. From this viewpoint, Rommel's eventual opposition to Hitler was too little, too late. He had been happy to serve the Nazi regime when it brought him glory and advancement. He had executed military operations that furthered Hitler's goals of conquest and racial domination. He had benefited materially and professionally from Nazi patronage. His opposition only developed when the war was clearly lost and when Hitler's strategic incompetence threatened Germany with total destruction. This was not principled resistance, but self-interested defection from a losing cause. Moreover, even his belated opposition was half-hearted and conditional. He did not actively participate in planning the July 20th coup, did not commit to assassinating Hitler, and did not take decisive action to undermine the regime. His death by forced suicide, while tragic, does not erase years of willing service to evil. This harsh judgment has considerable merit and should not be dismissed lightly. An alternative perspective is more forgiving of Rommel's actions and recognizes the genuine moral complexity of his situation. Rommel was a product of his time, place, and social position. He was raised in a culture that emphasized military honor, national duty, and obedience to authority. He came of age during World War I, which shaped his worldview and convinced him of Germany's martial virtues. He lived through the humiliation of Versailles and the chaos of Weimar, making him receptive to Hitler's promises of national restoration. He was not an ideological Nazi, but he shared many of the nationalist and conservative values that made Nazism attractive to millions of Germans. Given this background, his initial loyalty to Hitler and the regime was perhaps understandable, if not excusable. What matters more from this perspective is that he eventually recognized his error and turned against Hitler, even though doing so cost him his life. Many Germans never reached that point of recognition, They served Hitler to the bitter end, or afterward claimed they had not known or not understood. Rommel did come to understand, and he paid the ultimate price for that understanding. His death, forced upon him by the regime he had served, was a form of redemption, evidence that even those deeply implicated in a criminal system can experience moral awakening and resist, however belatedly. A third perspective might reject both the harsh condemnation and the generous forgiveness, instead viewing Rommel as a tragic figure whose story illustrates the dangers of professional military culture's emphasis on political neutrality and technical competence divorced from moral judgment. Rommel saw himself as a professional soldier whose job was to win battles and execute military operations, not to make political decisions or moral judgments about the regime he served. This self-conception allowed him to serve Hitler without confronting the moral implications of that service. He could focus on tactics and logistics and operational art while remaining blind or indifferent to the broader purposes for which German military power was being employed. Only when Hitler's strategic decisions directly impacted Rommel's ability to perform his professional duties, threatening the lives of his soldiers and the survival of his country, did Rommel begin to question his loyalty. Even then, his opposition was framed in military terms, the complaint of a general whose expertise was being ignored, rather than in moral terms, the revolt of a conscience awakened to evil. This professional detachment, this compartmentalization of military skill from moral responsibility, is what enabled talented officers like Rommel to serve monstrous regimes. It is a cautionary lesson about the limits of professionalism as an ethical framework. The question of military obedience under dictatorship has particular resonance in the post-war period and continues to be relevant today. After World War II, the Nuremberg trials established important precedents regarding the responsibility of military officers for illegal orders and war crimes. The defense of superior orders, the claim that soldiers were merely following commands and therefore not culpable for their actions, was rejected. The tribunals held that individuals have a responsibility to refuse illegal orders, and that obedience to authority does not absolve one of moral and legal responsibility for criminal acts. This principle has been incorporated into international law and military codes of conduct in democratic nations. However, the practical application of this principle remains challenging. How is an individual soldier or officer to determine which orders are illegal, particularly in the midst of war when information is incomplete and when disobedience may carry severe penalties? How much resistance is morally required? Is it sufficient to privately object, or must one actively refuse orders, even at the cost of one's career or life? These questions are particularly acute for officers in authoritarian regimes or in militaries that are complicit in state crimes. Consider the parallels and contrasts between Rommel and other military figures who face similar dilemmas. In the Soviet Union under Stalin, numerous talented military commanders served a regime that was responsible for mass murder on a scale comparable to Nazi Germany. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the Soviet Union's most celebrated World War II commander, led the Red Army to victory over Nazi Germany, liberating concentration camps and ending the Holocaust. Yet Zhukov also served a dictator who had executed tens of thousands of Red Army officers in the Great Purge of the late 1930s, and who was responsible for the deaths of millions of Soviet citizens through terror and famine. Zhukov's loyalty to Stalin and the Soviet system was never seriously questioned. He focused on his professional duties as a military commander and did not engage in political opposition. Should Zhukov be condemned for serving Stalin, or should he be credited with helping to defeat Nazi Germany, regardless of the regime he served? The answers to these questions are not obvious. Similarly, consider American military officers who participated in morally questionable actions during the Vietnam War or other conflicts. Generals who planned and executed operations that resulted in significant civilian casualties, who served administrations whose war aims were controversial or who carried out policies they privately questioned faced their own versions of the dilemmas that confronted Rommel. The fact that these officers served democratic governments rather than dictatorships changes the context but doesn't eliminate the fundamental tension between professional military duty and moral responsibility. In every military system, officers must navigate the competing demands of obedience to civilian authority, fidelity to military regulations and traditions, concern for their soldiers' welfare, and personal moral conscience. There are no easy formulas for resolving these tensions, and reasonable people can disagree about where the lines should be drawn in specific cases. What makes Rommel's case particularly instructive is that it demonstrates the evolution of one individual's thinking over time in response to changing circumstances and accumulating evidence of regime criminality. Rommel was not born a Nazi or a committed anti-Nazi. He began as a politically unengaged professional soldier with conservative nationalist sympathies. He was drawn to Hitler and the Nazi movement because they promised national renewal and military strength. He served the regime loyally and effectively for years, achieving great success and receiving substantial rewards. He began to have doubts only when he personally witnessed the consequences of Hitler's strategic incompetence and when the regime's survival came into conflict with Germany's survival as a nation. Even then, his path to opposition was hesitant and incomplete. He listened to resistance emissaries but did not commit to their plans. He criticized Hitler to trusted subordinates but did not openly defy orders until forced to by tactical necessity. He was prepared to participate in removing Hitler from power but wanted to do so through arrest and trial rather than assassination. Only when Hitler offered him the choice between suicide and public trial did Rommel make a definitive break with the regime, choosing death rather than continued association with it. This gradual, incomplete, and ultimately forced break with Hitler is probably more typical of how most people respond to serving under a criminal regime than the narrative of principled resistance from the beginning. Very few people have the moral clarity and courage to recognize evil immediately and to resist from the outset. Most people accommodate, rationalize, and compartmentalize. They tell themselves that they are doing their duty, that they are serving their country rather than a particular regime, that they can mitigate harm by remaining in their positions, or that they are powerless to change larger policies. They focus on their immediate responsibilities and try not to think too deeply about the broader implications of their actions. This is human nature. Understandable, if not admirable. Rommel's story is valuable precisely because it shows this common pattern of accommodation followed by belated recognition and resistance. It reminds us that moral awakening is often a process rather than a moment, that it requires courage to acknowledge one's own complicity, and that even late recognition and resistance have value, even if they cannot undo past wrongs. The impact of Rommel's death on the German military and on broader German society was complex. Within the Wehrmacht, Rommel's forced suicide was known to a relatively small circle of officers who had been privy to the truth. For most German soldiers, Rommel's death was presented as a tragic loss resulting from combat injuries, and this is how it was mourned. The official narrative that Rommel had died of his wounds was accepted by the majority of Germans until after the war. When the truth emerged in the late 1940s and 1950s through the accounts of Rommel's family and through post-war investigations, the revelation that Hitler had murdered one of Germany's most celebrated generals reinforced the perception of Hitler and the Nazi leadership as criminal and treacherous. For West Germany during the Cold War, Rommel's story became part of a larger narrative about good Germans who had opposed Hitler or who had served honorably despite serving a criminal regime. This narrative was politically useful as West Germany sought to reintegrate into the Western Alliance and to rebuild a democratic national identity distinct from the Nazi past. The West German military, the Bundeswehr, established in 1955, explicitly sought to learn from the failures of the Wehrmacht and to create a military culture based on democratic values, rather than blind obedience. The concept of innere Führung, or inner leadership, was developed to emphasize that soldiers are citizens in uniform, who retain their rights and responsibilities as citizens, and who have a duty to refuse illegal orders. The example of resistance figures including Rommel was held up as a model, though this simplified and idealized the historical reality. Rommel became one of the few Wehrmacht figures whose name could be invoked with honor in democratic Germany. Barracks were named after him. His life was taught as an example to officer cadets, and his military writings were studied as texts on tactical excellence. This rehabilitation of Rommel's reputation was not without controversy. Critics argued that it minimized his willing service to Hitler for most of the war and created a misleading narrative of clean Wehrmacht that obscured the reality of military complicity in Nazi crimes. In broader popular culture, Rommel became an iconic figure, the subject of numerous books, films, and documentaries. The 1951 film, The Desert Fox, The Story of Rommel, starring James Mason, portrayed him as a noble warrior trapped in an evil regime, a portrayal that influenced public perception for decades. More recent scholarship and cultural productions have provided more nuanced views, acknowledging both Rommel's military talents and his willing service to Nazi Germany, both his eventual opposition to Hitler and the limited nature and late timing of that opposition. The debate over how to remember Rommel continues. In 2018, the German military began a review of its tradition of honouring Wehrmacht figures, including consideration of whether Rommel's name should continue to be associated with military installations. The review reflected changing attitudes toward the Wehrmacht and recognition that military excellence does not automatically merit honour if that excellence was placed in service of criminal ends. The broader lesson of Rommel's story is that historical figures are rarely simple heroes or villains, but complex individuals whose choices and actions must be understood in context while still being subject to moral judgment. Rommel was an extraordinarily talented military commander whose tactical innovations and operational brilliance were genuine. He was also a willing servant of the Nazi regime who furthered Hitler's goals through military victories and who only turned against Hitler when it became clear that continued loyalty would lead to Germany's destruction. He was a man capable of personal courage and professional competence, who was also capable of moral blindness regarding the regime he served. He eventually recognized his error and paid with his life for that recognition. But this does not erase the years of service that preceded it. Understanding Rommel requires holding all of these facts in tension, rather than reducing him to a simple narrative of either heroic resistance or willing collaboration. For students of military history and ethics, Rommel's career offers valuable case studies in both tactical excellence and moral failure. His campaigns in France and North Africa remain subjects of study in military academies worldwide for their demonstrations of armoured warfare, combined arms operations, and aggressive exploitation of enemy weaknesses. At the same time, his relationship with Hitler exemplifies the dangers of professional military culture that emphasizes technical competence while neglecting moral responsibility, that stresses obedience to authority while discouraging critical evaluation of that authority's purposes, and that cultivates personal loyalty to leaders rather than fidelity to laws and principles. The tension between these two aspects of Rommel's legacy, the brilliant commander and the compromised servant of evil, mirrors larger tensions within military professionalism itself. How can militaries maintain the discipline and cohesion necessary for effective operations, while also ensuring that soldiers and officers retain the moral agency to refuse criminal orders? How can professional military education cultivate tactical excellence while also developing ethical judgment? These remain live questions that Rommel's story helps to illuminate. Another dimension of Rommel's legacy concerns his impact on the culture of military commemoration and the politics of historical memory. The decision about whether and how to honour military figures from morally compromised regimes is not unique to Germany or to the Nazi period. Many nations face similar questions about their own histories. Should Confederate generals be honoured in the United States despite their fight to preserve slavery? Should imperial commanders who committed atrocities during colonial wars be celebrated for their military achievements? Should officers who served authoritarian regimes but later opposed them be treated as heroes of resistance? These questions have no easy answers, and they tend to generate intense debate because they touch on fundamental issues of national identity, historical justice, and the relationship between military service and political morality. The evolving treatment of Rommel in Germany reflects these broader tensions and serves as a case study in how societies negotiate the difficult terrain of historical memory. The significance of Rommel's relationship with Hitler extends beyond individual biography to illuminate larger patterns in the history of World War II and the Nazi regime. One crucial aspect is what Rommel's trajectory reveals about Hitler's relationship with the German military establishment. Hitler came to power with the support of conservative elites, including significant portions of the military leadership, who believed they could use Hitler to restore German military power while controlling his more radical impulses. This proved to be a catastrophic miscalculation. Once in power, Hitler systematically undermined the independence and professional judgment of the military leadership, replacing conservative aristocratic generals with officers who were personally loyal to him, like Rommel. However, even these personally selected commanders eventually ran afoul of Hitler when their professional assessments conflicted with his ideological imperatives. The pattern repeated across the German military leadership. Generals who won Hitler's favour through early victories later fell from grace when they recommended realistic strategic adjustments rather than fanatical resistance. Hitler's management of his senior commanders combined capricious favour with brutal punishment, creating an atmosphere of fear and sycophancy that corroded military effectiveness. Rommel's career also illustrates the Nazi regime's reliance on propaganda and personality cult. Hitler understood the importance of military heroes in maintaining public morale and regime legitimacy. Rommel was perfect for this purpose. His non-aristocratic background made him relatable to ordinary Germans. His daring tactics and battlefield successes provided dramatic material for propaganda. His physical appearance and personal style, the leather jacket, the goggles, the direct manner, were easily mythologized. The Nazi propaganda machine built Rommel into a larger-than-life figure, the exemplary German soldier fighting against overwhelming odds. This propaganda served multiple purposes. It boosted morale during difficult periods of the war. It distracted from defeats and setbacks by celebrating individual heroism. It reinforced Nazi ideology about German superiority and martial prowess. However, this same propaganda value made Rommel's eventual disloyalty particularly threatening to Hitler. If Rommel publicly opposed Hitler or was publicly tried as a traitor, it would shatter the carefully constructed image and undermine the regime's narrative. This is why Hitler chose to stage Rommel's death as resulting from combat injuries rather than execute him publicly. Even in death, Rommel remained useful to the regime as a propaganda symbol. The question of what Rommel knew about Nazi atrocities and when he knew it is important for assessing his moral responsibility. Rommel spent most of the war commanding forces in theatres relatively distant from the worst Nazi crimes. The Holocaust, the systematic murder of 6 million Jews, occurred primarily in occupied Poland and the Soviet Union, areas where Rommel never commanded. The Einsatzgruppen death squads that murdered over 1 million Jews and others in mass shootings operated on the Eastern Front, not in North Africa or France. Rommel was not directly involved in planning or executing these crimes. However, the idea that he was completely ignorant of them is difficult to sustain. By 1943 to 1944, information about mass murders of Jews and other Nazi atrocities had become widely known within Germany, even if the full scope and systematic nature of the Holocaust remained obscure to many. Rommel, as a field marshal with access to senior leadership and intelligence reports, would have known at least in general terms that terrible things were being done in the occupied territories. What remains unclear is how much he knew about the specifics, how deeply he inquired into these matters, and how this knowledge affected his thinking. The evidence suggests that Rommel, like many Germans of his generation and social position, harboured anti-Semitic prejudices that were commonplace in German society, though not to the virulent degree characteristic of committed Nazis. He appears to have regarded the persecution of Jews as regrettable, but not as a central moral issue requiring his attention. His focus was on military operations, and he compartmentalized the regime's crimes as a separate matter beyond his responsibility. This compartmentalization was psychologically necessary for him to continue functioning as a commander, but it was also a moral failure. By the time Rommel turned against Hitler in 1944, his opposition was motivated primarily by strategic and patriotic concerns, the recognition that Germany was being destroyed by Hitler's leadership rather than by moral revulsion at Nazi crimes. This does not mean Rommel approved of the Holocaust or other atrocities, but it does mean he did not allow them to fundamentally alter his relationship with the regime until military circumstances forced a reckoning. This pattern of moral compartmentalization, of focusing on professional duties while avoiding confrontation with larger evils, was common among Wehrmacht officers and helps explain how talented and decent individuals could serve a genocidal regime. The evolution of Rommel's strategic thinking is another aspect of his story worth examining. In the early war years, Rommel was an aggressive, offensive-minded commander who believed in decisive action, bold maneuver, and relentless pursuit of the enemy. His successes in France and North Africa validated this approach and earned him a reputation as a master of mobile warfare. However, by 1944, circumstances had changed dramatically. Germany no longer had the resources or strategic initiative for offensive operations. The proper military strategy, as Rommel came to recognize, was defensive warfare aimed at making the cost of Allied victory so high that the Allies might consider negotiating rather than demanding unconditional surrender. This required different tactics, focusing on fortification, defense in depth, and calculated retreats to preserve forces rather than dramatic offensives and last-ditch stands. Rommel's work on the Atlantic Wall reflected this strategic evolution. He understood that Germany could not defeat the Allied invasion, but hoped to make it so costly that political consequences might follow. However, Hitler's strategic vision remained anchored in fantasy, believing in inevitable final victory and refusing to countenance realistic defensive strategies. This fundamental disagreement over strategy was a major factor in Rommel's growing alienation from Hitler. The personal toll that the war and his relationship with Hitler took on Rommel should not be overlooked. By 1944, Rommel was physically and emotionally exhausted. He had spent years in combat zones, had been wounded multiple times, had witnessed the deaths of countless soldiers under his command, and had shouldered enormous responsibilities. The constant stress, the inadequate resources, the interference from Hitler and the High Command, and the increasingly desperate military situation wore him down. His letters to Lucy during this period reveal a man struggling with doubt, frustration, and growing despair. He loved Germany and the German army, but he could see both being destroyed by Hitler's obstinacy and the broader criminal character of the regime. This created an agonizing internal conflict. His sense of duty pulled him toward continued service and obedience, but his reason and his conscience told him that such service was leading to catastrophe. The resolution of this conflict through his contact with the resistance and his eventual forced suicide was tragic, but perhaps inevitable, given the impossible situation in which he found himself. Rommel's relationship with his fellow commanders provides additional context for understanding his position within the German military hierarchy. He had complex relationships with other senior officers, characterized by professional respect, mixed with rivalry and disagreement. His relationship with Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, who commanded German forces in Italy and later in the West, was marked by mutual professional regard but also by significant strategic disagreements. Kesselring was more optimistic about Germany's chances and more willing to accept Hitler's leadership, while Rommel grew increasingly pessimistic. His relationship with Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt was similar. Rundstedt was an aristocratic Prussian officer of the old school, while Rommel was a bourgeois upstart who had risen through Hitler's favour. They disagreed fundamentally about defensive strategy in France, with Rundstedt favouring mobile reserves and Rommel insisting on defeating the invasion at the beaches. Despite these differences, both men came to similar conclusions about the hopelessness of Germany's military position and the need to seek peace, which led to both being sidelined by Hitler. The fate of Rommel's family after his death provides a final chapter to his story. As promised, Lucy and Manfred were protected from persecution. They received Rommel's full pension and retained the family home in Herrlingen. However, they lived under surveillance and suspicion for the remainder of the war. After Germany's defeat, Lucy had to navigate the complex politics of occupied Germany. The French military government that controlled the Herrlingen area initially treated the family with respect, particularly after the truth about Rommel's forced suicide became known. Lucy lived quietly, rarely giving interviews or making public statements about her husband. She died in 1971, having preserved Rommel's papers and legacy for future historians. Manfred Rommel, who had been 15 when he witnessed his father's final hours, was conscripted into the German military in the final months of the war as an anti-aircraft gunner. He survived the war and went on to study law and enter politics. Manfred Rommel's post-war career is itself a fascinating epilogue to his father's story. He joined the Christian Democratic Union and became involved in local politics in Stuttgart. In 1974, he was elected Lord Mayor of Stuttgart, a position he held until 1996, making him one of Germany's longest-serving mayors. As mayor, Manfred Rommel was known for his pragmatism, his moderate conservatism, and his efforts to promote reconciliation and historical honesty. He spoke publicly about his father's life and death, neither whitewashing Erwin Rommel's service to the Nazi regime nor accepting unfair criticism of him. Manfred argued that his father had been a patriotic German who served his country, but who ultimately recognized Hitler's evil and paid with his life for that recognition. He also emphasized the importance of learning from history rather than simply judging it. Manfred Rommel's success in democratic politics and his thoughtful approach to his father's legacy helped shape the post-war reputation of Erwin Rommel and demonstrated that the children of Nazi-era figures could contribute positively to democratic Germany. The question remains, what is the real reason Rommel betrayed Hitler? The answer is multifaceted and cannot be reduced to a single cause. On one level, Rommel's opposition to Hitler was driven by professional military judgment. He recognized that Hitler's strategic decisions were catastrophically wrong, that Germany was being destroyed by Hitler's refusal to face reality, and that the only way to save Germany was to remove Hitler from power and seek peace. This was a rational, pragmatic assessment based on military facts. On another level, Rommel's opposition was motivated by patriotism. He loved Germany and was horrified to see it being led to total destruction. Hitler, in Rommel's view, had become Germany's greatest enemy, sacrificing the nation for his own ideological fanaticism. Removing Hitler was an act of loyalty to Germany, not a betrayal of it. On a third level, Rommel's opposition may have involved moral awakening. While the evidence suggests his moral concerns were secondary to strategic ones, it is possible that by 1944 Rommel had come to recognize the fundamentally criminal nature of the Nazi regime and felt complicit in its crimes. His willingness to listen to resistance emissaries and to contemplate action against Hitler may have reflected not just pragmatism, but genuine moral evolution. It is also important to acknowledge what did not drive Rommel's opposition. He was not motivated by democratic principles or liberal values. He remained a conservative nationalist who believed in authoritarian government and German greatness. He was not driven by sympathy for Nazi victims or opposition to the Holocaust. While he may have disapproved of Nazi atrocities, they were not the primary cause of his alienation from Hitler. He was not seeking personal advancement or attempting to position himself for post-war rewards. By 1944, Germany's defeat was certain, regardless of who led the government, and opposition to Hitler was far more likely to result in death than in power. Rommel's opposition to Hitler was genuine, but limited. He wanted to save Germany from complete destruction, not to transform it into a democracy or to atone for Nazi crimes. Understanding these limits is as important as recognizing the courage it took to oppose Hitler at all. The broader historical significance of Rommel's story lies in what it reveals about the nature of totalitarian regimes and the choices individuals face under such systems. Totalitarian governments demand total loyalty and seek to eliminate all spaces for independent judgment or moral autonomy. They penetrate every aspect of society, from political life to professional activities to personal relationships. They reward loyalty with advancement and punish dissent with death. In such environments, opposition requires extraordinary courage and often seems futile. Most people accommodate, finding ways to justify their compliance or to compartmentalize their doubts. Those who do resist often do so belatedly and incompletely, having first tried to work within the system. This pattern is visible not just in Nazi Germany, but in other totalitarian regimes throughout history. Understanding why talented and decent people serve evil regimes and what finally drives some of them to resist is essential for understanding 20th century history and for preventing future atrocities. Rommel's forced suicide on October 14, 1944 was a carefully orchestrated murder designed to eliminate a potential threat to Hitler while avoiding the propaganda damage of a public trial. It was the culmination of a relationship that had evolved from mutual admiration to deadly antagonism. Hitler had elevated Rommel, used him for propaganda purposes, and benefited from his military talents. But when Rommel's professional judgment and patriotic concerns led him to question Hitler's leadership, Hitler did not hesitate to eliminate him. The choice offered to Rommel, suicide or trial, was really no choice at all. Trial would have meant torture, conviction in a show proceeding, and execution, with the added horror of his family being persecuted. Suicide at least spared his family and preserved his reputation. The fact that Rommel chose suicide rather than defiant resistance does not diminish the tragedy or the injustice of his death. He was murdered by the regime he had served, killed for the crime of recognizing that regime's destructive nature. In the final analysis, Erwin Rommel was a brilliant military commander who served an evil regime, a patriotic German who came to see that patriotism required opposing Hitler, and a complex individual whose choices illuminate the moral dilemmas of war and dictatorship. He was neither a pure hero nor a simple villain, but a human being facing impossible choices in extraordinary circumstances. His story serves as a reminder that historical figures must be understood in context while still being subject to moral judgment, that technical excellence does not excuse moral failure, and that even belated recognition of evil and resistance to it have value. The real reason Rommel betrayed Hitler was that he finally understood, too late to change the outcome, but not too late to make a choice, that Hitler was destroying Germany and that loyalty to the nation required disloyalty to the Führer. It cost him his life, but it also redeemed, however partially, his years of service to the Nazi regime. Whether that redemption is sufficient is a question that each person must answer for themselves, but asking the question is essential for learning from history. To fully appreciate Rommel's military genius and understand why his eventual opposition to Hitler carried such weight, it is worth examining in greater detail some of his tactical innovations and battlefield achievements. Rommel's approach to armoured warfare, while building on the theories of Heinz Guderian and other panzer pioneers, included distinctive elements that marked him as an original thinker. He emphasized the principle of Auftragstaktik, or mission-type orders, which gave subordinate commanders considerable freedom to achieve objectives using their own initiative rather than following rigid instructions. This approach allowed for rapid exploitation of opportunities and adaptation to changing battlefield conditions. Rommel also insisted on personal reconnaissance and front-line leadership. Unlike many senior commanders who directed operations from rear headquarters, Rommel regularly positioned himself at the point of attack, sometimes leading from the front vehicle in an advance. This exposed him to considerable personal danger. He was nearly captured on several occasions, but it also gave him immediate tactical awareness and allowed him to make rapid decisions based on direct observation rather than delayed reports. During the French campaign of 1940, specific examples illustrate Rommel's tactical methods. On May 13th, when his division reached the Meuse River at Dinant, Rommel personally led a reconnaissance to identify crossing points. Rather than waiting for extensive preparation, he ordered an immediate assault crossing using inflatable boats and engineer support. This aggressive action caught French defenders by surprise and established a bridgehead before they could organize effective resistance. Once across the Meuse, Rommel pushed his division forward without waiting for flanking units to catch up or for supply lines to be fully established. He gambled that speed and momentum would compensate for the risks of exposing his flanks and operating beyond supporting range. This gamble paid off as French forces, already demoralized and confused, were unable to organize coherent counterattacks against the rapidly advancing Germans. Rommel's division moved so fast that French commanders could not determine where the main German effort was being made, contributing to the general collapse of French resistance. In North Africa, Rommel adapted his tactics to desert conditions and demonstrated remarkable operational flexibility. The vast, featureless terrain of the Western Desert required different approaches than the close terrain of Europe. Navigation became a critical skill, as did the ability to move large formations across trackless sand and rock. Water and fuel were constant concerns, limiting operational range and requiring careful logistics planning. Rommel mastered these challenges and turned them to advantage. He used the open terrain to execute wide flanking movements that threatened British supply lines and rear areas. He concentrated his armour for decisive attacks rather than dispersing it in support roles. He used combined arms tactics, coordinating tanks, artillery, anti-tank guns, and infantry to create mutually supporting formations. His use of the 88mm anti-aircraft gun in an anti-tank role was particularly devastating, as this weapon could destroy British tanks at ranges where British guns could not effectively return fire. The Battle of Gazala in May to June 1942 provides a detailed example of Rommel's tactical artistry. The battle began with Rommel's forces executing a wide flanking movement around the southern end of British defensive positions, attempting to encircle British armour and supply dumps. Initially, the attack went badly. German tanks ran into unexpectedly strong British positions and minefields, suffering heavy losses. Rommel's forces became trapped in what became known as the Cauldron, a pocket surrounded by British forces with limited supplies and under constant attack. Many commanders would have retreated at this point, but Rommel recognized that the British were not exploiting their advantage effectively. He organized a defensive position using the 88mm guns to create a killing ground for British tanks, then launched limited counterattacks to expand his perimeter. Over several days of intense fighting, he wore down British armoured strength while preserving his own forces. Once he had achieved local superiority, he broke out of the cauldron and resumed his offensive, eventually forcing British forces to retreat and setting the stage for the capture of Tobruk. Rommel's greatest weakness as a commander was his tendency to focus on tactical operations at the expense of strategic considerations and logistics. He was a master of battlefield maneuver, but often neglected the broader operational and strategic context. In North Africa, this manifested in his repeated advances beyond what his logistics could sustain, forcing retreats when supplies ran out rather than enemy action defeating him. He clashed repeatedly with Italian commanders and German high command over resource allocation, often demanding resources that simply did not exist or could not be delivered given Allied control of the Mediterranean. His focus on immediate tactical opportunities sometimes blinded him to larger strategic realities. This weakness was not unique to Rommel. Many talented tactical commanders have struggled with strategic thinking, but it limited his effectiveness as a senior commander and contributed to his frustration with Hitler's strategic direction, a frustration born partly from Rommel's own difficulty in thinking strategically rather than tactically. Another aspect of Rommel's character worth examining is his relationship with the soldiers under his command. By all accounts, Rommel was genuinely concerned for his troops' welfare and was respected and admired by the men he led. He regularly visited frontline units, spoke with ordinary soldiers, and took interest in their conditions. This was not merely performative, but reflected a genuine sense of responsibility for the men whose lives he directed. However, his aggressive command style and willingness to take risks meant that he sometimes pushed his troops beyond their limits. The rapid advances that made him famous were exhausting for the soldiers who had to execute them. The supplies shortages that resulted from outrunning logistics meant his troops often fought while hungry, thirsty, and short of ammunition. Casualty rates in Rommel's units were often high, a cost of his aggressive tactics. Whether this constitutes good or bad leadership is debatable. Rommel achieved remarkable results, but at significant cost to the men under his command. The soldiers seemed to accept these costs because they believed Rommel was trying to achieve victory rather than merely following orders, and because he shared their dangers rather than directing from safety. The treatment of prisoners and civilians by forces under Rommel's command is relevant to assessing his character and the nature of the North African campaign. Rommel generally enforced the Geneva Conventions regarding treatment of prisoners of war and did not permit or encourage atrocities against civilians. British prisoners captured by the Afrika Korps were generally treated correctly according to international law. There are accounts of Rommel ordering the execution of a German soldier who had mistreated prisoners and of him reprimanding subordinates who did not adhere to proper standards. This relative restraint stands in sharp contrast to German conduct on the Eastern Front, where prisoners and civilians were systematically abused and murdered. However, it is important not to overstate this distinction. The North African campaign involved relatively few civilians compared to the Eastern Front, limiting opportunities for atrocities. The strategic situation did not require the kind of brutal occupation policies implemented in the Soviet Union. Moreover, Rommel's forces did commit some war crimes, including shooting prisoners in certain circumstances and mistreating Arab populations. Rommel's relatively clean record in this area reflects both his personal standards and the specific circumstances of the North African theatre, rather than any fundamental opposition to Nazi ideology. Rommel's writings, particularly his book Infantry Attacks and his later tactical papers, provide insight into his military thinking and his evolution as a commander. Infantry Attacks, published in 1937, was based on his World War I experiences and focused on small unit tactics, the importance of aggressive leadership, and the value of exploiting enemy weaknesses through rapid action. The book was well received professionally and remained a standard text in German military education for years. It also attracted Hitler's attention and contributed to Rommel's later advancement. In his later tactical writings and in letters to Lucy, Rommel reflected on the lessons of armoured warfare and the challenges of desert combat. These writings reveal a thoughtful practitioner who was constantly analysing his experiences and refining his methods. They also reveal his growing frustration with strategic constraints and his increasing awareness that tactical brilliance could not compensate for strategic disadvantage, a recognition that contributed to his eventual disillusionment with Hitler's leadership. The comparison between Rommel and other celebrated commanders of World War II provides additional perspective on his abilities and limitations. Compared to German contemporaries like Heinz Guderian, Erich von Manstein, or Gerd von Rundstedt, Rommel was more tactically aggressive and more willing to take risks, but less strategically sophisticated and less politically adept. Guderian was a better theorist of armoured warfare and a more systematic thinker about operational art. Manstein was a superior strategic planner and had a better grasp of the broader military and political context. Rundstedt was a more conventional commander, but also a more stable and reliable one. Rommel's strengths were in tactical innovation, personal leadership, and exploitation of opportunities. His weaknesses were in strategic planning, logistics, and working within command hierarchies. Compared to Allied commanders like Bernard Montgomery, George Patton, or Dwight Eisenhower, Rommel was perhaps more tactically creative than Montgomery, comparably aggressive to Patton, but far less able than Eisenhower at coalition management and strategic coordination. Each of these commanders had distinctive strengths and weaknesses, and historical rankings of their relative abilities depend heavily on what criteria are emphasized. The historical debate over Rommel's reputation and legacy continues to evolve as new evidence emerges and as historical interpretations change. Early post-war accounts, particularly those written by former Wehrmacht officers and by some British military historians, tended to portray Rommel very favourably, emphasising his tactical brilliance and his eventual opposition to Hitler while minimising his service to the Nazi regime. This Rommel myth served various purposes for different audiences. For Germans, especially in West Germany during the Cold War, Rommel represented a Germany that could be admired despite the Nazi period. For British and American audiences, Rommel as a good German who opposed Hitler fit comfortable narratives about World War II that distinguished between evil Nazis and decent Germans. For military professionals, Rommel's tactical achievements provided valuable case studies without the moral complications of studying commanders who remained loyal to Hitler or who were directly involved in atrocities. However, beginning in the 1980s and accelerating in recent decades, historians have subjected the Rommel myth to critical examination. This revisionist scholarship has emphasized several points. First, Rommel was a willing and enthusiastic servant of the Nazi regime for most of the war, benefiting substantially from Nazi patronage and using his fame to support the regime's propaganda efforts. Second, his opposition to Hitler came late and was motivated primarily by pragmatic and patriotic concerns rather than fundamental moral objection to Nazism. Third, the clean war narrative of the North African campaign, while containing some truth, has been overstated and obscures the reality that Rommel was fighting a war of aggression in service of a criminal regime. Fourth, Rommel's tactical brilliance, while genuine, should not overshadow the fact that this brilliance was employed for evil purposes. This revisionist perspective does not deny Rommel's military talents or the reality of his forced suicide, but it places these facts in a broader and more critical context. The result is a more nuanced but less heroic portrait of Rommel, one that acknowledges both his abilities and his moral failures. The most recent scholarship attempts to move beyond the binary of myth versus revision to achieve a balanced assessment that recognizes complexity and contradiction. This approach acknowledges that Rommel was genuinely talented, that his tactical innovations were real and influential, and that his eventual opposition to Hitler, however limited and belated, represented a significant break with the regime. At the same time, it insists on recognizing that Rommel served Hitler willingly for years, that he benefited from and contributed to Nazi propaganda, and that his opposition was incomplete and came too late to materially affect outcomes. This balanced approach treats Rommel as a complex historical figure whose actions must be understood in context while still being subject to moral evaluation. It rejects both hagiography and demonization in favor of careful analysis of evidence and recognition of human complexity. This is perhaps the most intellectually honest approach to Rommel's legacy, though it is also the most challenging because it requires holding multiple perspectives in tension rather than resolving them into a simple narrative. The question of what lessons contemporary military professionals and citizens should draw from Rommel's story remains actively debated. For military ethics education, Rommel provides a case study in the limits of professional military culture and the importance of moral agency. His story illustrates that technical competence and tactical brilliance are insufficient without ethical grounding, that obedience to authority must be balanced against moral responsibility, and that recognition of evil, even if belated, requires the courage to resist. For students of history and politics, Rommel's trajectory from loyal servant to regime critic illustrates the dynamics of authoritarian rule and the process by which individuals come to recognize and oppose tyranny. For general audiences, Rommel's story is compelling precisely because it defies simple categorization. He was neither a hero nor a villain, but a deeply flawed human being who made terrible choices in service of an evil regime, but who eventually recognized his error and paid with his life for that recognition. Whether this is sufficient redemption is debatable, but the very fact that we debate it demonstrates the enduring power and relevance of Rommel's story. Well, that's it. Thanks for watching. We hope you found this video informative. If you enjoyed learning about Rommel's complex relationship with Hitler and the moral dilemmas faced by military commanders under dictatorship, make sure to check out our other videos about World War II history and the men who shaped this pivotal period. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on more fascinating historical content. Your support helps us continue bringing you in-depth explorations of history's most compelling stories. See you in the next one.